The Allied bombing of Germany during the Second World War will always, I suspect, be a subject for debate amongst military historians. This normally revolves around the ethics of the bombardment of civilian targets, or else whether the cost borne in heavy losses and the sheer industrial expenditure the Western Allies poured into the campaign was worth for the damage inflicted upon German war production. In fact, I suspect just by bringing these topics up, discussions will already be occurring in the comments of this video. But there is definitely one impact that the bombing had on the conflict, and that is the efforts that the German military put into trying to combat the raids. After all, on top of inspiring German developments in radar and improved ordnance, probably the biggest impact was in pushing a range of aeronautic innovations. The Me-262 jet fighter, for example, despite repeated interference from Hitler and friends, was to prove a truly formidable bomber killer. And while the Me-163 rocket fighter was often subject to some unfortunate tendencies, such as blowing up spectacularly or melting the pilot in the event of a fuel leak, there can be no denying that the aircraft, despite issues, was an extremely innovative idea. Indeed, the Luftwaffe and German aircraft designers were to explore a host of cutting-edge ideas to improve the capabilities of the next generation of interceptors to protect the fatherland from the hordes of Allied bombers attacking day and night. However, it is notable that many of these programs and ideas push for new technologies to try to combat the problem. Hardly surprising, but still technically and industrially expensive to pursue, especially as time pressures became more important as the impact of bombing began to bite. One of the key problems for any of these designs, and the existing piston engine interceptors then fighting above Germany, was that aircraft are by nature delicate machines. Quite often, only a small amount of damage to something like the engine, flight surfaces, or fuel tanks, let alone the pilot, will render the aircraft at best combat ineffective or even a complete loss. The innovative new technological proposals generally pushed new forms of propulsive technology to boost the aircraft speeds to make them harder for defensive gunners to hit, while the existing fighters ended up getting laden down by ever increasing amounts of armour. But one German company, Blohm and Voss, thought they might have a solution by identifying the key weaknesses in interceptors: the pilot, engine, and fuel system. They reckoned that the way to reduce attrition in the Luftwaffe interceptors was not to build them faster, but to make them tougher. And the best way to do that was to reduce the critical systems in an aircraft subject to damage, which would also allow armour to be concentrated into tighter areas. And so came up the idea for the Blohm and Voss BV-40, a glider interceptor. In 1943, B&V proposed to the Reich Air Ministry that they could build the Luftwaffe a glider that would use non-strategic materials that could be used to attack enemy bomber formations. Their suggestion was that a glider could be towed by a fighter, such as a Bf-109, up to altitude, detach from its tractor, and then destroy a bomber by ramming it in the tail. For the Luftwaffe, the idea actually had a lot of appeal. The gliders could be built from steel and wood, materials that were available in quantity and would allow for construction by non-specialist workers and factories, as well as not requiring the use of precious aircraft-grade alloys that were critically needed for the production of conventional aircraft. Additionally, training pilots would be simple, quick and cheap, as gliders were used for initial pilot flight instruction anyway and would make qualifying personnel on the new engineless interceptor extremely simple. So yes, the concept of an easily mass-produced interceptor that didn't drain critical resources, combined with the ability to quickly train new pilots, all added up to the possibility of allowing the German air defences to very rapidly build up their numbers. You can see that the idea had a lot of merit, on paper at least. There was one reservation from the Luftwaffe, however. They didn't think that the glider, despite proposed armour protection, would fare very well in the face of the sort of defensive fire that Allied bombers mounted, especially in their tail turrets. So they asked Blum and Voss to add a single 30mm cannon, with which the glider pilot could neutralise the tail gunner before conducting his ramming attack. They also requested that the pilot not have a seat, instead lying prone in the cockpit. This would allow the aircraft to have a much smaller frontal profile, which would make it a more difficult target for enemy gunners to hit, allow armour to be further concentrated, and also helped with the G-forces that the pilot would experience on his sudden drop into his attack run. The German Aviation Research Institute had in fact already built a small aircraft, the Berlin B-9, to examine this idea, and the design team from Blohm and Voss were able to use this to test ideas on how to build a prone pilot cockpit. Things were progressing rapidly, but Richard Vogt, chief designer at Blohm and Voss, and whose brainchild the glider interceptor was, began to have reservations about the idea of ramming attacks. In December 1943, a meeting finalised the concept and set the new requirements for what became the BV-40. Instead of attacking by ramming the tail of the target, the aircraft would be armed with two of the very powerful Mk108 30mm cannon. Though these would only have a mere 35 shells per cannon, this was more than enough to devastate any aircraft, with German assessments at the time concluding that only 4 hits from this gun could bring down a B-17 or B-24 heavy bomber, while a single shell would destroy an enemy fighter. On top of this, it was proposed that the BV-40 also tow a 10 kg explosive charge on a steel cable behind it, which could also snag on a target bomber and then explode, though that idea seems to have fallen out of favour as the program progressed. 6 prototypes were ordered, and construction of these was rapid, and the simplicity of the design enticed the Reich Air Ministry to state that should testing prove successful, then they wanted 200 of the aircraft built a month. The BV-40 was, as you can see, tiny compared to a conventional fighter, with the fuselage only being 2 foot 3 inches wide, the wingspan just 25 feet 11 inches, and an overall length of 18 feet 8 inches. Compare that to the Messerschmitt Bf-109G, itself hardly a large aircraft, with a wingspan of 32 feet 7 inches and a length of 29 feet 4 inches, and we can see that the BV-40 was truly tiny. The aircraft's superstructure was constructed almost entirely of wood, with the fuselage being skinned in plywood while the wing spar was constructed of laminated beech. The cockpit, however, was massively armoured, with frontal protection being a 20mm steel plate, while the sides had 8mm and the underside 5mm, while the windshield was made of bulletproof glass 120mm thick. On top of that, the aircraft's side windows had armoured shutters that could be slid shut during the attack run. The cockpit itself was as simple as could be, with basic instrumentation, the gun sight, a painted reticle on the windscreen, and oxygen gear and a parachute for the pilot. First flight occurred on 6th of May 1944, though on this first prototype the armour was left off. In terms of its characteristics, the histories are a little confused. One report by a test pilot indicates that the aircraft had reasonable handling, though this may well have been on the original test flights with no armour. Because once testing with weight occurred, at least 2 of the 5 prototypes that flew were quickly lost in accidents, and the design of the armour scheme went through some alterations as part of the test program. Also mysterious is the actual speed the BV-40 was capable of. Some design estimates rated the aircraft up to a maximum speed of 560 miles per hour in a dive, though most sources are sceptical that the BV-40 could achieve that and hold together. In fact, the top recorded speed during the testing was 292 miles per hour, and the test program was curtailed before the BV-40 could be pushed further. Because, truth be told, the idea that seemed to have merit in mid-1943 was recognised as out of date by early 1944. By that point, the US heavy bombers, which would have been the main target for the BV-40, were operating no longer alone, but with fighter escorts. Once that happened, it was realised that the BV-40 was just a sitting duck, with its heavy frontal armour being of zero value against fighters attacking from the rear. Indeed, the flight tests only occurred because the whole program switched over to Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Unit, who wanted to examine the possibility of using the glider for ground or maritime attack with bombs or torpedoes. Hardly surprisingly, their conclusions were that the BV-40 was not suitable for these roles, and in August 1944 the program was shelved after a total of 17 flights had been conducted, with Blohm and Voss storing the surviving aircraft in a hangar at their production facilities. When this was bombed by B-24s, ironically the exact kind of aircraft the BV-40 was designed to attack, the whole lot was destroyed, closing a rather odd and unique chapter in aviation history.